I think so far as your paragraph 12 is concerned, you have reviewed the medical records, which we have at tile 158, please. And then Dr Marnerides says, I have not reviewed the medical records. And then he says, sorry? I have extracted the information from the medical records and I state it in my reports because that's the job of the clinicians, to assess the medical records. He replies, yes. So I strictly followed my instructions, did a pathology review. So this, I extracted it from the report by Dr Evans that I received. Yes, thank you. So I didn't go through the medical records. He replies, no, of course not. So that's quite interesting. So does he read the medical records, or is he just going on the word of Dr Evans? So I strictly followed my instructions, did a pathology review. So this, I extracted it from the report by Dr Evans that I received, or were the medical records part of his report? I don't know. So I didn't go through the medical records. Right. That might be brought up in cross-examination possibly, but we'll carry on. Mr. Marnerides, from the clinical assessment I had, my understanding was that this baby did not die from pneumonia. The clinical assessment was that the baby died with pneumonia. Mr. Johnson, what about the fact that you were unable to find overt evidence of air embolism? He replies, I cannot, on the basis of not identifying air bubbles on the histology from the pathology point of view, say that I can refute the clinical suggestion of this being the likely explanation for the cause of death. I cannot prove it, and we know that this is the nature of this beast. We know that post-mortem identifying air, either using methods that cannot be used in mortuaries with respirometers, is not reliable. If you see air bubbles on histology, that is something in keeping. If you don't see them, you can't say that that's not the case. So you need the clinical information and the clinical assessment. So he's talking about all the background information in terms of what happened and the picture concerning this child's health. Yes, so what conclusions did you draw so far as the cause of? He replies, the conclusion is that the infection that was there, which appears to be a congenital infection, so explicable on the basis of the premature rupture of the membranes, would not sufficiently explain the death. And in my opinion, it does not explain the death because I have taken into account the clinical assessment. There is no other natural disease that has been brought to the attention of this case by the clinical review that could explain death. There is no other morphologically evident natural disease from the post-mortem examination. So my view is that this baby died with the pneumonia in terms of natural diseases rather than dying from the pneumonia. So in terms of unnatural causes, my findings, the findings of the post-mortem examination, my findings from the review of the histology, cannot positively confirm it, but cannot refute it either. The findings that confirm it are findings of the radiology, and the findings and the assessment by the clinicians, and that's how I came to the conclusion in relation to the cause of death here. Yes, what was that conclusion? He replies, I think the likely explanation of this baby dying is air embolism. And is that by the same means? He replies, by the same means, yes, injection of air into a vascular access line. Mr. Johnson, but that is based on your assessment of the clinical and radiological evidence rather than, and then he jumps in, it's based on the co-assessment of the clinical radiological views with the findings of the post-mortem and my findings. Mr. Johnson, in other words, no other evidence of disease which could account for this premature death. He replies, I couldn't identify it. And then he says, thank you. Can we move on to the case of child E? Right. Do you accept that pneumonia could be a contributing factor to the death in this case? He replies, you mean in part 2 of the formulation of the cause of death? Mr. Myers says, yes, did it play a part in this? He replies, if there is clinical support that the baby was unwell clinically because of pneumonia, I think, yes, it could be a potential contributor. Now, I'm going to follow up on that. I'm not going to leave that there, Dr. Marnerides. We'll follow through with that. You explained to us yesterday, when dealing with this in particular, that you relied on the clinicians and the radiology in forming your final conclusions about the cause of death in this case. He replies, the immediate cause of death, yes. In particular, and with regard to the question of pneumonia, you considered the course of events as described by the clinicians. He replies, yes. And that includes the opinion of Dr Evans, is that correct? He replies, correct. You've also had the benefit of opinions by Sandy Bowen, is that correct too? He replies, correct. And the position you take from the clinical review is also someone called Ward Platt, who's featured in it as well. The position you take from the clinical review, relying upon that, is that child D was in effect stable at the time or shortly before the collapse. Is that correct? He replies, that's my understanding, yes. And indeed, a description or an expression used by Dr Evans and referred to in your report is that there had been, quote, a window of near complete recovery prior to the collapse. That's talking about her condition at birth through to the period of collapse sometime later. So against that background, against that clinical assessment, you then go on to consider the possibility of whether this was an air embolus, which is a suggestion that's been raised. Is that correct? He replies, I considered the proposed mechanism, yes. So your conclusion is based on the co-assessment of the clinical review and the radiology in particular. Is that correct? He replies, and the pathology. And the pathology. Insofar as the pathology doesn't identify any, for instance, natural mechanism that could otherwise explain this. He says alternative. Alternative, yes. Although the question of pneumonia is settled to a large degree to you because of the clinical descriptions of the recovery and stability prior to the collapse. He replies yes, because the experience is that babies at 37 weeks of gestation who are born with congenital pneumonia, unless they develop sepsis, which was not the case here, or other complications, they will recover. So if the clinical indication is that the baby was recovering and stable, and this is my understanding from what I was being, then this would be a baby dying with pneumonia rather than from the pneumonia. Mr. Myers, all right, that's what I wanted to establish. Thank you for dealing with that.
Let's see what happened. So she was admitted, and as I said to you earlier on, she was already sick on that day. On the following day, she developed fever. She had intolerance when the CPAP was removed. In other words, she could not tolerate coming off the CPAP support. She had continuing deterioration of blood gases over the next day. She had increasing metabolic acidosis. All these indicates that the infection was in fact getting worse. Her baby was not stable. And then on the next day, on day 3, she further deteriorated with rising CRP. Now, CRP is the test we do to see whether there's infection. And if the CRP is going up, it means the infection is getting worse. If the CRP is going down, it means it's getting better. And this was going up. There were repeated episodes of apnea and desaturation, again indicating the baby was clinically getting worse, not better. She then developed prolonged coagulation times. Coagulation times means how long does it take for your blood to clot? And normally, for all of us, it should clot within a certain period of time. If it takes longer than that, it means that there's a coagulation defect. Something is wrong with your blood. And in this case, the coagulation time was increased. Now, this is a serious development because it indicates that the infection is going out of control. Most of us, when we are infected, we are sick, whatever, the coagulation times don't change. But if the coagulation times change, it means that this baby is going into what is called disseminated intravascular coagulation. And this is a condition that appears when the baby is severely infected and severely ill because it causes spontaneous coagulation of the blood throughout the whole circulatory system. The blood just starts to clot everywhere. And as it clots, it consumes the coagulation factors, and that's why you see a coagulation defect. And then that leads to spontaneous bleeding in all the organs and elsewhere in the body. So when you see something that's starting to cause coagulation defects, this is in fact an early sign of DIC that is developing. And so The blood vessels in the skin are compromised, because if you have clotting in the blood vessels of the skin, they compromise the blood flow, which together with hypoxia triggered dilation and contraction of the small vessels in the skin, which then results in the skin discoloration that you see, and tracking lesions and so on. And she ultimately collapsed and deceased. So this baby died of systemic sepsis, pneumonia, and disseminated intravascular coagulation. The mother should have received intrapartum antibiotics prior to delivery. There was delay in recognizing respiratory distress after birth. There was delay in starting antibiotics and delay in starting treatment for the respiratory distress. We did not find any evidence of air embolism.